Well, there's one comment I would make, because we do clinical trials here. I have for years throughout my career, as has Dr. Shannon, I'm sure. The issue is, our priority is always patient welfare first. So there may be somebody who is eligible for a trial, but there could be other alternatives for treatment. And one has to, I, as an investigator for a clinical trial, I have to weigh what's in my patient's best interest. It's not being in a clinical trial necessarily. People come to me sometimes inquiring about whether they are eligible or not for a clinical trial, but I have to weigh these things myself. Would it be in their best interest to participate or not? And that can be quite difficult in some cases. Yes, sir, over here.
You can't see me. Good morning, doctor. We've had a lot of pharma reps come to our support group, and often they'll mention that we are approved overseas, but not here in the U.S. yet. I've developed kind of a subtle, at least a subtle impression that maybe our FDA is a little hyper cautious. And I hope in the process they're not rejecting some drugs that might be beneficial. Can you give a perspective on approvals overseas, phase-wise or otherwise, compared to our FDA?
So yeah, the approval process overseas, and I can talk about Europe, is very different from the FDA. So the FDA is very strict about, is much more involved in every step of the trial versus like in Europe, for example. And even if the drug is approved in Europe, it still needs to go through the whole approval process in the FDA. There are different pathways for drug approval. For example, for an established drug such as levodopa, there's a different pathway which sometimes can be shorter, but it's a completely different process for approval.
I would just add that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the FDA's main objective is to be safe and to make sure that things that they ultimately do approve, that the benefits clearly outweigh risk, because there are risks to everything. To everything they ultimately approve, and some of them are serious risks. And as was pointed out, there are on occasion things that get through, and the complications or potentially even life-threatening risks don't become apparent until after the approval and the drug is exposed to more people. So in Parkinson's disease, it's not uncommon that in the clinical trials we're recruiting, the overall multi-center trial has got 300 people in it, but when it's exposed to 50,000 people, things can sometimes be picked up that you don't see in the clinical trial. And an example for Parkinson's is a medication called tolcapone years ago, or Tasmar, where there was really no clear-cut indication that it could be liver toxic to some people, and it caused 5 or 6 deaths by fulminant abrupt liver failure after it was released on market. So I think this sort of being hyper cautious is not, by the FDA, is not a bad thing. I think this is a good thing. It's frustrating, I know, because it seems to be delaying things that are approved in Europe or approved in Asia. But I would prefer that people be more cautious than not. In the back, there's a question. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I've got another question. When they do all this research, they're looking for safety. Do they also figure out, is it really good? It really does a great job for us? Or is there any scale on that? Sometimes the side effects sound worse than the good part. So do they track that? And it works? How well it works?
Or the side effects sometimes outweighing the benefits.
So I think the focus on safety and effectiveness at the FDA, that the question that they want to answer really is, what is that balance? What we call a risk to benefit ratio. And we try not to prescribe drugs that have a risk to benefit ratio where there's more side effects than good effects. But we recognize that there's no two people in this room who are identical in their response to any medication. You're genetically individualized, you've got other medicines. And so once something is kind of on the market and approved, then prescribing it really is a relationship with your physician where we see how the medication affects you in the context of your disabilities and your Parkinson's disease and the other medical conditions you might have. So no matter how much data is accumulated in clinical trials, every time we start a medicine on a person, it's a new adventure for both the doctor and the patient. And balancing that risk to benefit ratio is the most important thing. Does that answer your question or no?
Thank you very much.
I would also add that clinical trials and clinical practice are not identical. The clinical trials provide us with information that one could sort of think are guidelines or give us information of going forward. But really taking a new medication from a clinical trial to the clinic is for me, anyway, it's kind of a step of nervousness for me. How is it going to actually work in the real world?
And because the inclusion criteria you heard about are fairly strict, when studies are designed, the goal is to get the most information with the least expense and the fewest people having to be exposed to your medicine. So there's a tendency to really enroll people who fit into a tight kind of pattern of disease severity, et cetera. And then as soon as you open it up to everybody, then you start to see things you wouldn't see in the clinical trial. So I agree that when a new drug comes on the market, it's always with a little bit of trepidation, even if you've been involved in the clinical trials. How's this going to work in my practice? But that's why you go to the experts, quite frankly.
And to add, as Dr. Shannon mentioned, in a clinical trial, you have a specific target group of patients with the inclusion-exclusion criteria. There are very close follow-ups. There's a lot of discipline because they are committed to follow the trial procedure, which in real world, there are many changes, It's very different. So that's why sometimes you don't see exactly the same results in real world.
Yes, sir, here.
Yeah, so my question, my dad was actually going through a clinical trial. And there was a point where he felt he wasn't, he felt like he was maybe getting a placebo and spending all this time and energy going through these trials. And what would you say to people who are going through that and that feel like they might be just getting a placebo and feel discouraged to continue the trial? What would you say to kind of keep them going through it?
People who do clinical trials are really contributing to our knowledge base. And as was pointed out in the slides by Dr. Bonnie Saad, nothing happens we don't have new therapies, without people participating. It just can't move forward. The other thing I would say, which is kind of interesting, is that people think they're getting placebo. At the end of clinical trials, we usually get an unblinding. We get information who got what. And it's rather striking. People think I'm getting placebo, or they think they're getting the real thing because they're having side effects. They're often wrong. I did a trial some years ago with Botox for chronic migraine. And one of the concerns is that the trial would be unblinded because, as you know, Botox is used for wrinkles. And we were injecting Botox across the forehead as well as other locations to see if it would be beneficial for people with chronic migraine. And people said, I know I'm getting the Botox because my wrinkles are better. And they were wrong. They could not tell. In many cases, they couldn't discriminate. And people get, as you know, they get side effects from placebo. People get dizziness or sleeplessness from placebo effect, or they get better from placebo effect. I think it's a very serious decision for people to participate in clinical trials. Again, our agenda here, and I think most places, if not all places, is that of patient well-being first. That always comes. And although we prefer this not to occur, if people say midway through the trial, I don't like this, they can leave any time. Nobody's going to hound them or criticize them. And most of the people I've enrolled in clinical trials have come from my own practice. So these are people I've known oftentimes for years. And I don't, if somebody says, well, I've changed my mind. Okay, no problem.
I'm careful to tell people when they enroll in clinical trials that the purpose of their enrollment is not to feel better. The purpose of their enrollment is to get drugs approved and on the market that will benefit the greater population at large. And the reason we do placebo-controlled studies is a significant number of people get better on placebo, and just as a significant number of people get side effects on placebo. So they're absolutely critical. And that's a remarkable phenomenon, that just the act of taking a pill or a shot will make you better. But it's true for every disease state. So, they're all placebo-controlled trials. But it's just a remarkable human condition, observation that just taking a pill makes you feel better.
I would also add that I think both of us have been involved in clinical trials that have failed. Unfortunately, on more than one occasion, that's always a disappointment. But the other thing is we learn something from those failures. You saw isradipine, this blood pressure medication that was being tested to see if it may slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. And the science that was based upon seemed pretty sound, but the trial failed, sadly. But that tells us something. That helps us rethink how we're moving forward. The same was with rasagiline, another study that was, this was maybe slightly, rasagiline, Azilect, is approved to treat symptoms of Parkinson's, but there was some information that suggested it too may slow the progression of Parkinson's, and that trial, in my opinion, was not successful, and it was not approved by the FDA for that reason. But every time we encounter that, we think, oh, well, what was our mistake? What did we think should have been occurring and did not?
And I want to add to the placebo question. So FDA oftentimes requires us to have a placebo-controlled trial, and the patient might feel worse. Again, it's because of the information that are required, that are needed for the trial. But all patients, as we talked about, are protected, right? Safety is, again, the first and foremost concern. And there are several institutions that are concerned about the patient protection. So we make sure the patients, there are no safety issues, the patients are protected in the trial. And again, this is one of the risks of not getting the study drug when you participate in a trial.
Yes, over here.
So this is a question I have for the physical therapist, probably most likely. With regards to intensity of exercise, what are some specific guidelines you would give us, like as far as how often, like how many times a week, how many minutes each time, just so that we have like an idea of what intense activity looks like?
It's going to be different for everybody, so the guideline I would give you is just go and have a full, in-depth, comprehensive exam through your physical therapist to determine what's going to be safe and optimal and the most challenging for you as an individual. Because it's really hard to make a blanket statement. In terms of just general exercise guidelines, there's plenty of those, but it's going to be different for a patient with Parkinson's, and anyone who has a movement disorder. The intensity tends to need to be a lot higher, and what that means for each person is going to be different.
Okay, so you would highly recommend that they see a physical therapist?
Yes, that's
From
the
the
best
get-go.
possible way to do it,
Okay.
the safest way to do it.
Okay, thank you.
And you're welcome.
Way over here, and then we'll come back to the middle.
Yeah, could you comment on the potential for government price controls on its effect on new drug development?
That's a tough one.
That's that's the question that's on everybody. I mean, the pricing of medications is an issue for all of us, and it's coming. I'll get back to your question in just a moment, but it's enormously frustrating to me. This seems like it might fit my patient. It may be beneficial for my patient, but the cost is so prohibitive that it's not. And insurance companies are just going to say no. So I can't get these therapies sometimes to my patients who I think would be deriving benefit from them. I don't know if that's your role or not to comment about potential price controls and how that could. I don't know the answer, but this drives us all crazy in so many ways. The cost of medications, the insurance restrictions, and I don't know if there's a villain any place. There's got to be a solution somewhere, but it really is. Every day, multiple times a day, something I find very irksome. Or, since I'm getting excited, I have to call somebody who doesn't know anything about Parkinson's disease, but they work for an insurance company, and I have to wrangle with them on the phone about getting something to my patient, or they just reject it out of hand. Or if I'll go further, if I order an MRI scan for somebody that I think needs an MRI scan, and an insurance company saying, no, first I got to call somebody and wrangle with them on the phone about why they say no, they're going to reject. I don't know the solution here. I'm just whining.
I think it's sometimes helpful to have a discussion with the, so a lot of the newer add-on medicines will give you 1 extra hour of on time a day.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, how much should we be willing to pay for 365 additional hours of on time a year? Should we be paying $3,000 a month or more?
Yeah.
Probably not. I mean, so part of it is, and you're a little bit, you're a little bit insulated from the price, because if your insurance company will cover it, you might have a low copay, you might be able to take advantage of a patient assistance program offered by the drug company. But ultimately, these costs are borne by our society at large through the insurance companies, and we do need to have a discussion about how this is going to happen going forward. I once had a talk with someone who was an Alzheimer's disease researcher, and he said, if we find the cure for Alzheimer's disease, the country will go bankrupt because there are so many Alzheimer's patients. You'll have to build factories to make the medications, and it's just, this is not sustainable. So as much as we want to find cures, we need to have a larger conversation about how we're going to pay for those cures.
I'll come back to you in just a moment. Yes.
Yeah, at what stage do drugs get fast-tracked? And is there any promising drugs in PD that are being fast-tracked, could possibly be fast-tracked?
There is one that is approved. Glucocorticoid was fast-tracked, for example. But coming up, I'm not aware of any fast-track PD drugs at the moment.
I can't think of any that are under fast track right now for Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
There are things, again, people ask me every day, what looks interesting or promising? And there are things that look quite interesting. There are interesting trials underway or getting underway for Parkinson's disease. I don't know how they will turn out, but it's not like there's a lack of interest or a lack of trying. There's a lot of interest worldwide.
One thing that's happening in the Alzheimer's market is that some of the recent failures of drugs that were thought to be highly promising has led some drug companies to back away from Alzheimer's disease. We haven't seen that in Parkinson's disease, because these are really costly research studies to do, and if you can't find a drug that has an outcome that's positive, sometimes it makes the drug companies a little bit shy about going after the target. So I'm hopeful that doesn't happen in Parkinson's as far as...
I think it's happened a bit. There's still some activity. There's quite a bit of activity in Parkinson's in terms of therapeutic developments, but I think there has been, when things have failed, I think that sends a chill to some companies. GSK, for example, has not. They used to have a medication, ropinirole, Requip, and then Requip extended release, and they kind of pulled back actually from central nervous system things, at least Parkinson's disease, because of some chilling of this perception that it was so difficult to get something successfully through and approved.
And it's not as if those drugs are being approved in Europe either. They're failing testing and then causing a little bit of a reluctance to keep going that way with those real expensive trials.
Oh, yes, up here. Sorry.
Who pays for the drug trials?
Who pays for the drug trials? Some basic research is paid for by your tax dollars, by National Institutes of Health, but the majority of drug trials are paid for by the companies that sponsor the medication that they're trying to get approved. So this truly is research and development investment in the studies, and then if your drug's not approved, that's the money you can't recoup that investment. That's why it costs $1.5 billion on average. I've even heard $3 billion because so many medicines don't make it all the way through, and then the ones that get all the way to clinical trials often, or sometimes don't prove to be effective. There's a lot of cost associated with drug development.
So
we're paying for some of
basically,
it, but the industry's paying for most of it.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question, then we're going to break again.
If placebos work, you ever prescribe it?
Oh, that's a great question. So
It is a good question.
it's a
Go
great
ahead.
question. So the question is, if placebos work, do you prescribe them? And when I was an intern, we had something in the pharmacy called Obicalp, which is placebo spelled backwards. And you could prescribe it, but it's completely unethical to prescribe.
And it doesn't necessarily persist. So the placebo effect can be a short term, few months, or so type of response. Interestingly, there is reason to believe that the placebo effect, at least sometimes, is mediated by dopamine.
Yeah.
That anticipation of continued reward will increase dopamine levels, at least transiently, which makes it more challenging for studies in Parkinson's disease. I think
And
we're going
really
to...
important for those to be placebo.
Yes, yeah, and all the more reason to do that. I think the schedule says we're taking another break, and then Bethsaida's going to beat us up again for a while, and then we'll get back to our, or move us around for a while, and then beat us up. So we'll come back in a little bit.